Welcome. This is the Buddhist Medicine and Yoga podcast. I'm honored to have Michael Sheehy here, who is the Director of Research at the Contemplative Sciences Center. And many of us know of Michael Sheehy as a Jonang expert or specialist. I know there's a forthcoming book, but there's some recent research and an article that I'm very interested to hear about. So we'll start to discuss some topics with regard to Milam, or dream yoga and dream yoga research. Then the second topic for the listeners uh, is Gexel, a term that's there both in the completion phase practices and great completion. But here we'll be looking at yoga in terms of Gexel practices, and then contemplative research and Vajrayana meditation practices in general. So welcome, Michael Sheehy. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, James. It's a pleasure.
So thank you, Michael. You forwarded a couple of your recent articles. One of them touched on Dzogchen Ati Yoga in terms of two constructs. It was an article framing mindfulness, and what spoke to me were
Yeah.
two constructs of effortlessness and effort. Is there something that you could share with us about that in terms of mindfulness and the Dzogchen literature you translated?
Yeah, sure. So this is an article that my friend and collaborator at Kyoto University, Frenchman named Marc-Henri Desroches, and I have been thinking about together for several years, in particular through the writings of Jigme Lingpa, who is really the kind of revealer of the Longchen Nintig and this kind of visionary reboot of the Nintig tradition in the Dzogchen Nyingma. And Jigme Lingpa has a few very short, very interesting texts. We've translated one in the appendix of this article, and then we make reference to another, which was translated by Tinley Norbu Rinpoche in a little book of his. And we summarize that, and there's some other things that I think will be forthcoming. But it's very interesting because it's interesting to us as people who study meditation and as practitioners as well, because he's playing on this dynamic between attention of effortless, which Dzogchen makes a claim for being effortless, free, spontaneous, open, effortless awareness. And then the more conventional approaches to mindfulness, which are really very dualistic and effort oriented, where the subject duality, subject object duality, the subject object complex, if I may, between the self, the observer, or the subject, and whatever it may be, some sensation in the world, whether it be a sight, a sound, a smell, etc., or even one's thoughts, creating this kind of duality or subject-object divide. Most mindfulness, and Jigme Lingpa does a wonderful job of really detailing this and coming up with a descriptive language for what he calls antidotal mindfulness, which is a really lovely term. And we can talk about, maybe we'll return to that when we talk to the Gexel, because this is a theme that runs throughout the contemplative literature as a kind of paradigm, that is to say, the remedial or antidotal. You're applying something, but again, in this kind of dualistic fashion, very much in a prescriptive manner as you would a medicine. And he says there's instances, particularly when you're cultivating mindfulness, when you're a novice practitioner, but all the way through, even advanced practitioners, he says there are moments where you need to apply mindfulness as an antidote. That is to say, to counteract some ordinary habit of awareness. That is to say, there's a perceptual, cognitive, sensational momentum to do something, to act a certain way, perform a certain way, perceive a certain way, think a certain way, feel a certain way, and that those habits of awareness are very strong. And when there's a recognition of falling into those deeply ingrained habit patterns, the practitioner applies mindfulness as an antidote in order to counteract that, to bring this, it's called Dremba in Tibetan. It's literally, the term means to remember, right? To recall. And what are you recalling? You're recalling that capacity, that innate capacity, these traditions suggest, within the human mind to be aware of what you're doing and recalibrate. That is fundamentally the definition of mindfulness. And then you build a continuity for that, right? But that sometimes it needs to be applied as an antidote in this, again, dualistic fashion in order to kind of almost trigger the sense of, ah, yes, I've slipped from my mindfulness. Now, what's interesting is and we can talk about non-dual mindfulness as well, or non-dual meditation, which he then segues into. And we talk about this in the paper. This is our framing of it, understanding Jigme Lingpa, but also, the sort of broader paradigms within the tradition between effortful and effortless, which are paradigmatic of contemplative discourse, certainly in the Tibetan tradition, as a spectrum, of effortful from effortless. So it's not to think of this is effortful and that's effortless in a binary, which if you just read it, sometimes these texts, if you're just reading them quickly, or if you're not having the orientation that's experiential, I think it's easy to slip into that. Like they're talking about some binary, the light is on, the light is off, right? Some switch. In fact, that's not how we understand it. We understand it much more as a spectrum, that there's a gradation that the practitioner can, oscillate up and down according from the effortless to the effortful, and then back again in the scalar effect, or kind of modular scaling across the spectrum. So we call this kind of spectral phenomena of mindfulness that comes from the Dzogchen tradition. And we want to also, if I may, just sort of point out one of the brilliant, in my mind, moves that Jigme Lingpa makes as to orient and contextualize mindfulness, particularly within the kind of Dzogchen framework, this kind of non-dual meditation orientation. And to get away again from this kind of binary of a kind of dualistic antidotal mindfulness is the only application you have, which I think has a lot of resonances with contemporary prescriptions of mindfulness, certainly in clinical settings. But more broadly, I think the way that mindfulness has come to be construed and discussed within kind of contemporary discourses is almost entirely dualistic. So Dzogchen saying, well, actually, this is a spectrum. So what is it if it's not a binary, right? Back to this point, I think that's so imperative is the pivot. And Jigme Lingpa does this really beautiful thing. And he says the pivot point is that flow of awareness in which you're aware of the contents of consciousness. So this gets called in Tibetan, there's a compound term called dren, which I mentioned, will translate as mindful or mindfulness, and she. And she means to know, but it's a contraction of the full term in Tibetan, which is shejin, samprajna in Sanskrit, which means we translate as meta awareness. Now, I think that this is really important for contemplatives, because what he does here in this kind of just gentle gesture, right? This kind of just subtle gesture, he says what pivots this kind of dualistic orientation of the subject being mindful of whatever it's mindful of. While that's happening, notice what's happening underneath the currents of consciousness, what he calls the contents of consciousness. That is to say, there's a kind of subliminal undercurrent, and meditators know this, right? If you're sitting for long periods, you may be thinking about something and then feeling something underneath, right? You may be thinking about something that has a kind of gross orientation, and then some other kind of subliminal thoughts may be happening underneath it. He says awareness of awareness, that is to say, awareness of the contents of consciousness, whatever it is, whatever you're aware of, that he calls meta awareness, or Sheehy in Tibetan. And he says that these two, it's not just Jigmeling, but it's a compound we find throughout the contemplative literature of mindfulness and meta awareness. Those two you develop as a practitioner to oscillate back and forth between. And he says the more you cultivate meta awareness, awareness of the contents of consciousness, and you can then rely on that as being this kind of underlying sustaining or continuity of awareness, so that you then gradually, or from time to time, shift from being mindful of something to noticing that gradual undercurrent of awareness, the continuity of awareness, what we call meta awareness. He says that the being aware of awareness, being aware of contents of consciousness, is the doorway, the segue to non-dual awareness. He says the more you understand that, the more you cultivate that experientially through your practice, then gradually dualistic mindfulness, antidotal mindfulness shifts, fades, and that puts you on the spectrum trajectory towards non-dual mindfulness or
So
non-dual meditation.
absolutely. This is a wonderful segue because the first thing that stuck out to me, I really wanted to hear how you were translating shades in,
Shijin, yeah, yeah,
uh, better with the Sanskrit. So I was looking at Samprajanya, Sampra,
yeah.
and for listeners, sometimes we speak of Smriti Upasthana, or in Pali, Sati Upartana. Foundations of mindfulness. So the translation here is meta awareness for Shadzin. And later in the text, I think in your article, you use the phrase metacognition. So I
Yeah.
noticed that you were clear in separating meta awareness from metacognitive awareness, or metacognition, which is a psychological construct
That's
which
right.
has to do with knowing the contents of the mind. So it seems to be a very deliberate translation. If I could bring up one other idea, is that we're speaking of view, meditation, conduct, and fruition as a model for understanding Buddhist contemplative practice. So sometimes when we look at a distinction like this, the view is different in Ati Yoga, Laktong Vipassana, or awareness practice versus common Sutrayana mindfulness. Is there anything that you could bring together with in regards to these concepts?
Sure. Yeah, no, there's a lot there. I will say, just to sort of zoom out a little bit, my work as I've come to understand it over the last certainly 7 or 8 years now, um, has become more and more of an interdisciplinary project. I've come to think in terms of the value of interdisciplinarity, or at best transdisciplinarity. And um, my training is in Buddhist studies and Tibetan studies, and in living and studying with Tibetans, and reading Tibetan texts, and trained as a textualist, but also doing a lot of field work in Tibet. So I come out of that training and have the first kind of stage of my career, the impulse was preservation. And I spent the first, after my PhD work, I spent the first phase of my career preserving Tibetan text and doing field work in Tibet to digitally preserve rare Tibetan manuscripts. And I then shifted and from a sort of stage of preservation to a stage of translation. And even though my training is very much as a textualist and translating words, and I feel very comfortable doing that and translating text, I've also come to realize or feel more that translation is a cultural project and that there is a kind of what I'll call cultural translation that needs to occur that is both temporal as well as situational or contextual. And sort of just saying this as in response to this very um, acute observation you made between the difference between meta-awareness and metacognition. In some scientific discourse on mindfulness, there is the word metacognition has come a buzz term. And it's used, it's a psychological construct that has its own independent history as an idea and has been brought or imported into the contemplative meditation research literature, particularly the scientific research literature. And also it's used in education, contemplative education. They talk about metacognition all the time. I think that isn't quite resonant with the Tibetan understanding of what we translate as Sheijin. And so a little bit on that term, Sheijin or Samprajna is, um, the canonical chapter in the Bodhicharya Avatara describes this in just, Shantideva does this eloquent waxing on this. And if you look just in the history of the translations of the Bodhicharya Avatara, how people have translated just that word in that chapter, it's typically as vigilance or introspection, um, and so on and so forth. And I think that these don't quite capture what the contemplative tradition is trying to capture in that, may be fine. I think those translations may be fine as sort of colloquial translations in and of themselves in English or from the Tibetan into English for kind of colloquial readers. But we're at a moment here where there are multiple readerships in English who are thinking about the constructs and applications of contemplative practices, and that invites kind of this interdisciplinary project. And I think that it's important for us as Buddhist studies folks, as translators and people steeped and trained in these traditions, to try to think in some sensitive manners to what these terms that we choose might mean within the broader disciplines in which we're navigating. For myself, sort of contemplative research, in which there's lots of scientists. And vigilance means something very, very specific. Introspection means something very specific. It has a history from William James, and introspection is a whole tradition. And that's not at all what they're talking about. Metacognition also, as you aptly pointed out, it's awareness of thought, cognition, right? Metacognitive powers are the powers of the mind to recognize thought. And what we're saying here, as I understand it, and we understand it from the Tibetan literature, certainly in Jigme Lingpa's case, but I would argue in Shantideva's as well, is what they're saying is actually what they're interested in is all contents of consciousness. And the fundamental Abhidharma model of the contents of consciousness, which all the Buddhists agree on, is that the contents of consciousness are manifold and multifaceted. They derive from our five sense faculty, and the sixth faculty is the mind. So it includes thoughts, it includes emotions, it includes sensations, but all the perceptual experiences. So that's why we opted for meta awareness, just to kind of to do two things. One, to really capture, and I can do the etymology. She means to be aware. So shepa is just to know, to be aware. It's the same she as in sherab, which people translate as wisdom. It's the same she that you'll find in yeshe, which I translate as pristine awareness, or people also translate that as wisdom. It's the same she as in namshe, which I translate as ordinary awareness. People translate as consciousness. So she is all over. It just means to be aware. It's very common use in technical and colloquial Tibetan. But the compound is Shejin, and the Jinpa means, and they take it from the Sanskrit, some particle is to that's the meta part, right? It's the knowing of the knowing. So it works very well, I think etymologically, and it also captures this kind of contemporary construct that we can now talk to people in cognitive sciences and psychology and say, look, this is meta awareness. And they say, oh, okay, well, I understand what that means. There's some very interesting work happening on meta awareness, in fact. It differentiates it from metacognition, which would only limit it to the mind and make the whole project very cerebral and cognitive oriented, which, of course, the mind is inescapable, and yet the project is bigger. The project of being aware is bigger than thoughts, and that's what the Buddhist traditions, I think, are trying to capture. Certainly, Buddhist psychology and Buddhist contemplative traditions.
Can I raise a thorny question about
Yeah,
disciplinarity? So Zoran Josipovic was kind enough when I was leading an earlier course this year on NDA, non-dual awareness.
yeah,
So my concern when I looked at this body of research and some of the front matter of his articles um, was characterizing non-dual awareness in relation to great completion practices. And I think this will apply to the dream yoga research is one of the questions I had. So we can use the term awareness as a normal colloquial term. And for neuroscientists, they might be looking at neural correlates or signatures in distinction from mindfulness findings. But my concern is how to work with the view. So if we say something like awareness, no rungs in tugje, and associated with this are manners of pedagogy, transmission, and practice, how one rests in awareness, and what is the nature, the phenomenology of that experience. So if we hook ourselves up and we have papers that have some findings that might report on non-dual awareness, the subjective experience of that meditator who's coming from a great completion background training, or let's say they're using constructs like open awareness, or if it was a Zen practitioner or Trika Shaivism. Now, resting in awareness, there are subtleties to how we experience and narrate contemplative experience from that vantage point. So I'm wondering if there's any conflict when we work interdisciplinarily and these fine-grained differences
yeah.
might not be caught. So, and specifically with the dream practices or luminosity. So, how do you feel when you're working with NDA and yeah, some of these awareness constructs?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really great. And um, there's a whole body of literature as you're, referencing called non-dual awareness, NDA, which is becoming it's sort of been put on the map in the last several years in the cognitive sciences. And I'm actually now thinking through and preparing a paper for later this spring on the idea of open presence. Okay, so there's this phrase called open presence that gets used in the literature again and again. And it goes back to the 1980s, I think was the first study that first used open awareness, where they were studying some Tibetans and Tibetan practitioners. And it has got sort of caught on in the, so open awareness, open presence, sometimes they're synonymous, etc. But they're certainly synonymous with non-dual awareness in the scientific literature. And what they're translating is this term chokshak, which is a very technical term in the Dzogchen literature. I mean, it's a Tibetan term. It's used more broadly, but in the Dzogchen context, it means resting. It's a phase or sort of state, if you will, of resting. And there's different descriptive models, kind of phenomenological descriptions of kinds of resting. There's this famous Chokshak, the four restings or the four kind of states of being at rest, and it's like a mountain, like an ocean, and so on and so forth. And then there's, resting in awareness itself and so forth. So one of the things I'm doing just on that one word, right? Just that one concept that's been put out there and published in the scientific literature is dialing it back and saying, okay, well, what is this? If you want to say that it's equivalent to this Tibetan term, what does the Tibetan literature say? And I'm going through and from sort of Longchenpa up until there's this really amazing um, material, even in the 20th century. And we have this back in the 17 tantras, actually, is when we first see this use of chokshak and chokshak, the four restings and so forth, that there are descriptive accounts of the states of awareness, and they are phenomenologically rich, right? They're not just equating them with being in these kind of vacuous states, but actually describing them in really very beautiful poetic phenomenological detail. So I'm translating these and trying to bring them into conversation with some of these pieces that have been published in the scientific literature, where they're trying to sort of say, this is open presence, and they're trying to capture an idea or concept, but in a very different kind of methodology, right? So what I find interesting is teasing out these very tensions that you're illuminating and saying, well, look, let's not be so simple. There's a history here. There's experience that undergirds what we're talking about, and there's descriptive language, technical, poetic, etc. And let's unpack that. Let's breathe life into what we're doing. And that's not to push against and dismiss the research that's been done or these kind of paradigms in neuroscience, but is hopefully to enrich it and say, actually, if we're going to talk about these traditions, if we're going to talk about the experiences that are induced and elicited from these contemplative practices within these traditions, then let's understand that they have a deep, rich, articulate tradition. And what is that? And how is it expressed? How does it make sense in conversation with contemporary models and methods and frameworks? That's the kind of, again, it's almost like double translation, kind of the words, but yeah, they're cultural resonances as well.
I was watching a series of talks. I had missed this conference. I think you had put it together, Generative Contemplation Symposium,
Yeah, that's the one I hosted at the University of Virginia last April.
April, yeah. And part of one of your talks, you were quoting from Kyungpo Naljor and Taranatha, These are Shangpa masters on the 6 yogas of Niguma, but specifically this practice called Dream Yoga or Milam. And there's a ongoing research project. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So one of the practices that I study is called Dream Yoga. Yeah, Milam Naljor, the yoga of dreams, literally. And I did talk about it at that Generative Contemplation Symposia. I have published one article and I have another one in review stages right now. And it's part of a larger project that I'm collaborating with neuroscientists at Northwestern University at Ken Paller and his lab, sleep lab there at Northwestern. And they study all kinds of sleeping phenomena, but particularly dreams and dreaming. And we are very interested in, because it's this kind of interdisciplinary project, we're very interested in understanding the historical record of the prescriptive instructions for performing contemplative or yogic acts during dream time. And this is lucid dreaming. We could talk about that, but it's essentially dreaming while you're aware that you're dreaming, which is understood to be a skill that can be cultivated. And there's a whole body of literature, dream yoga literature in the Tibetan tradition, that works in a contemplative manner while you sleep in dream time. And there's a set of tasks that you perform, or sort of performances, contemplative performances. We can talk about that. What's interesting, so I'm looking at the historical literature, and there's multiple parties involved in this research, but we're looking at the historical literature, that what did Tibetans prescribe to perform during your dream, and yes, Kyumpo Naljor and Taranat are two of my favorites. Kyumpo Naljor is probably the earliest one to articulate. He's 11th century. Yes, Shangpa, a progenitor of the Shangpa tradition in Tibet, and he wrote these very early accounts from Naguma, who was the woman who transmitted historically these teachings, and they are parallel to the teachings of Naropa. In other words, they're um, they're called the same teachings, though the instructions are slightly different. So Tumo and Dream Yoga and Bardo and Poa and so forth. Um, and then Taranatha is a 17th century figure. He's sort of one of my main guys. I read a lot of Taranatha. He was a Jonang central figure in the Jonang tradition, and also central figure in the Shangpa tradition. Those were his. He was a very eclectic scholar, but those are the two traditions that he wrote most prolifically on and transmitted. And we have several accounts of these. So, anyways, looking at the historical literature and the instructions and unpacking that, what did Tibetans prescribe about what you do in your sleep during dream yoga practices? So that's been my project. And then the scientific side. So there's three sides. Then there's the scientific side of bringing contemporary dream yoga practitioners into the lab and Northwestern in Chicago, and studying them. Now, what's interesting about this lab in that we're working with, the Powder Lab, is that they have developed this technique to communicate with dreamers while they sleep, particularly while they're in a lucid dream, although they can do it at different sleep stages as long as the person is aware. So hypnagogia and so forth. But we're interested in while lucid dreaming, that is to say, while aware in a dream, they can signal to the person. Um, so I'll just paint the picture. So a dream lab is basically a room with a bed. And you go in and you hook up the EEGs, and there's sort of respiratory and heart rate and so forth, and you lay down and you go to sleep, but you can also hear while you're sleeping, right? And uh, there's audio system in the room, and that's all hooked up to somebody the outside of the room who has a video and audio ability to see the dreamer, the person sleeping in the bed in the room, and monitors their brainwave activity so they can tell exactly what stage of sleep they're in, whether it's hypnagogia or REM, light sleep, etc. So they can monitor their sleep stages, and when they go into dreaming, then the dreamer is asked to signal that they are in a dream. So you are aware that you're dreaming and you signal. And how do you signal? There's two ways that they train people to signal. One is blinking the eyes. You can blink your eyes while you're awake. And the second, which we found to be more reliable, is sniffs. So you can do, so they signal and they have a whole kind of language of the sniffs, if you will. That is to say, one sniff or two sniffs or three sniffs. It's very simple. So for instance, and there's a very lovely paper that came out, I guess the year before last on this. They put somebody in a dream, went into the state of lucid dreaming, and they asked them, there were several persons, so they would ask them, what is 3 minus, or what is 5 minus 3? And then they would blink twice. And they would say, what is 8 minus 6? And they would blink twice. And then they would say, what is 6 minus 3? And they would blink 3 times. And they did that over and over with simple math problems. They were asking the dreamers while they were in the dream state, and they were signaling the right answers. That is to say, they understood the question and they responded in a logical, coherent manner via the signals. So this is a huge breakthrough in sleep science, that we can communicate with dreamers while they're in their dream. And we are taking this in this current study. It's just a pilot. We're actually looking to extend this and looking for further funding. But right now in this pilot study that we're doing, we're bringing dream yoga practitioners into the lab. And rather than asking them mathematical questions, we're asking them to perform tasks prescribed in historical dream yoga manuals. Let me just give you an example. So for instance, some of the practices that a dream yoga practitioner performs while lucid in their dreams, there's a typical kind of sequence of 6 or sometimes 8. And these practices involve transforming appearances, for instance. So let's just say I'm in a dream and I'm in my bedroom as a child. And I walk out of the bedroom and I walk down the stairs and I'm in the kitchen. And on the kitchen, there's a pot of water, a jug of water. And I look and see the jug of water on the table. In the dream, I transform it to a bouquet of flowers. And then I'll turn and I'll see that there's something on the stove. Let's say, some brownies are cooking in the oven, and I'll then transform it and make it, a pot of soup on the top of the stove, and so on and so on and so forth. That is to say, the appearances that you encounter in the dream, you, as the dreamer, intentionally transform them. So it's a kind of shape-shifting of objects, phenomenal objects in the dream world. And that's something that is actually a very simple thing to do for dream yoga practitioners. So we ask them, for instance, to do that. And sometimes, when so then the test is whether they can do that and then signal to us when they've done it. So they'll be asleep in the lab, on their bed, they'll be able to see their brain activity. They'll go into a lucid dream. They'll perform a task. They'll see something on the table. They'll transform it. The simplest thing that we asked them to do is to make something turn into a flower. That's the simplest task. It can be a flower of any color. So maybe a red flower, and then a purple flower, and a blue flower, etc. So turn something that you see into a flower. That's a simple task. And when they do that, then to signal that they've done it. And then what that does is the people in the lab know exactly to the millisecond the neurophenomenological, not phenomenological, the neurophysiological data, right? What is happening in the brain right then? What is active? Are, areas of the brain of decision making being activated? Are they in REM sleep, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So that's the sleep side. So there's three sides. First is the historical, the second is the sleep. The third is then when they wake up, we have a interview with them that's based on this technique called microphenomenology, which is this refined, subtle elicitation technique of phenomenal experience, in which we have one of our team members who's trained in microphenomenology. They preset a Zoom call just like this. And when the dreamer wakes up, they describe their dream in the interview. What happened? I was in my bedroom when I was a child, and I felt the impulse to go downstairs, and on the kitchen table there was a pot, and I transformed it into a purple flower. And in the meanwhile, the interviewer's asking them very detailed questions to elicit their experience. What was the stairways like? Was it steep? Was there a railing? Did you put your hand on the rail? Et cetera, et cetera. And what this does is it invokes the memory of the lucidity in the dream. And in particular, we're interested in, of course, these kind of yogic or contemplative tasks that are being performed in the dream. What kind of processes were happening? What was the dreamer feeling? Was the dreamer in their own body? Did they recognize their body? Were they um, with someone else? Was it cold? Was it how they remembered it? What was the color, pressure, et cetera, et cetera? What are the kind of conditions in the dream? So this gives us kind of rich phenomenological data. So we have the historical prescriptions from the dream yoga manuals. We have the scientific study of what happens to the body and the brain in the lab while in the lucid dream performing these practices. And then we have the first person account of this kind of their experience. So this is the kind of work that I'm very interested in these days, to bring a kind of multi-perspectival, sort of rounded method, right? A sort of broader, rounder, sort of multi-method project to understand what's happening, again, from the historical record within the human organism and as people articulate their experience.
Thank you. I want to save some time also for this juicy topic, but there's a
Yeah.
phrase that used, I think it was either in your article or in the talk, and you quoted Tek Chot Zud, and maybe the third in the trilogy of Resting in Illusion.
Yeah.
I would just say from Gulu illusory body to training in the conduct of the great perfection. But you use the term perceptual plasticity. So some
Yeah.
of these yogas bleed into one another. But if you could briefly just explain what you meant by perceptual plasticity.
Yeah, so there's three kind of factors that I'm very interested in that I'm sort of formulating from my readings of the Tibetan Dream Yoga manuals. And one of them, uh, one is what I'm calling perceptual plasticity, which I'll talk about. The second is imaginal simulation, using the imaginative capacities of mind to simulate a new kind of experience. And then the third is somatic awareness, or really kinesthetic sense, awareness of the body and its movement within the dream world. And I'm very interested in the dream body and the dream world. In the So that actually works in tandem with this perceptual plasticity. That is to say, the idea that you can change your perceptions through intentional practice. And that dreaming, as these traditions suggest, particularly aware in a dream, practitioners can make decisions, right? They have volition, they have the ability to move in different directions. We can do things in the dream world we can't ordinarily do, right? We can fly, jump off cliffs, swim deep in the waters, shapeshift, change identities, wrestle wild animals, et cetera, et cetera. All these things we would not be doing in our ordinary waking life, right? Defy the laws of physics, some of them. So these traditions suggest we take advantage of that, that if we can cultivate the skills of lucidity while dreaming, we can then extend our sense of perceptual possibility. So this involves perspective taking, moving in different kinds of situations so that we see the situation from different perspectives. But it also involves literally changing what you see, the appearances and how you relate to those phenomenal appearances, such as I mentioned, the pot on the flower becomes the pot on the table becomes a bouquet of flowers. Then you're actually changing what you see. You have the ability to transform in a plastic manner um, the appearance. And they're saying that we can do this, as we know, we all do this, and not all, and I recognize not everybody dreams. There's and not everyone has had lucid dreams, and yet these are skills that are understood by these traditions, like many contemplative skills. In fact, the sort of broad swath of contemplative skills, what I call contemplative life skills, are cultivatable according to these traditions, that they are innate capacities that we can learn and be coached in and grow. So the skill of lucidity during the dream is one of them. Now, what's interesting is since the 1980s, there's been an emerging research in the scientific community um, about lucid dreaming. And there's been some groundbreaking work done, of course, Stephen LaBerge, and others, and they've really sort of set the tone for what it means to understand lucid dreaming within those frameworks. And one of the conclusions, in fact, LaBerge has this famous paper in which he declares that becoming lucid in a dream is a skill that you can develop. And this is exactly the claims being made by the Tibetan traditions in this literature. So again, not that it's about validating the historical record, but it's about understanding from different perspectives and different disciplines how experience operates and how we can thereby intentionally transform our experience, right? That's what the kind of contemplative practices are for.
I recall when I first tried to get in touch with you, I think you might have been presenting at a Mind and Life event, or I just caught wind that you were translating something possibly from a Richo, a mountain Dharma, mountain retreat text.
Yeah,
Might have been Yangompa or something, but it was on Gexel. Uh,
yeah.
so in a pre-publication article you had sent, uh, this concept of Gexel and Bogdan crosses different genres. And I wonder if you can share what is meant by Gexel
Hmm.
and by Bogdan and how that relates to yogic practices, perhaps of self-care.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is really amazing material. Let me just pause and just sort of acknowledge that this material is really incredible and deep and kind of genius. I've been reading this Gexel material, and so Gexel I translate as dispelling obstacles or obstructions, dispelling obstructions, and Bogdun, which refers to practices of enhancement. That is to say, how do we enhance, boost, if you will, contemplative experience through technique? And these two are meta genres, that is to say, sort of subgenres within contemplative uh, literature, within meditation manuals. That is to say, you'll find them complementary to all other kinds of what we call main practices or primary practices. So, for instance, there's Gexel literature on deity yoga, and there's Gexel literature on a lot of it is on the completion stage yoga. So, a lot of it is for like true core or these kind of subtle body yogic exercises on tumo or um, inner warmth yogas and so on and so on and so forth. You'll find these within different Vajrayana or tantric systems. That is to say, there's um, practices within these meta genres specifically for like the Sakyalam Dre or Havajra or certainly Kala Chakra. I'm very interested in, and Dzogchen and this and that and the other. And then, and this is the stuff that I've really come to appreciate, there are these um, practices that are just for whatever obstruction arises. And they're a kind of medical, like meditation as medicine kind of literature, right? And I have two articles on this that are coming out where I've translated excerpts and I'm trying to kind of frame things. And um, one of the interesting things about these practices is, well, two things. One is that they're for a range of ailments or disorders. So there's everything from like a headache to indigestion to anxiety to depression to insomnia, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a kind of whole range from physical to emotional and psychological disorders that they're identifying. So there's two ways that they do it. They say, what are the signs, the tak? In other words, how do you know that you have this? So it's a diagnostic process. And then the second is the prescriptive process. If you have these signs, this is how you practice. Again, as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about antidotal mindfulness as this application to remedy, we have a whole set of remedial practices or practices to antidote very specific ailments and disorders. Everything, again, from a headache to depression to insomnia, etc. So this stuff is very incredible. And what I've been doing is reading anthologies of practices. And they're very short. There's some of them are just a few lines. Usually they're just a few lines. Some of them at most a page or two. And they are compiled in these anthologies. I'm looking particularly, I want to understand the early material. So I'm looking at 11th century, a lot of stuff in the 11th century, but the materials in the 11th century, they're very like, they were probably just like scrapbooks. They were like yogis in caves who said, "Oh, this works and this works," and then they just sort of take notes down, and you can tell they're very much like literally this. They were experimenting with what worked and what didn't, and when it did, or they wanted to record it for some reason, they wrote it down, and then we have these. They're kind of just compilations of different people's notes, it seems, on how to practice. And that's very prevalent, particularly in the early Kagyu traditions. So, Pakmo Drupa, there's some really cool stuff. And The Drigung Kyabgong and so on, Jigden Gompo, all these guys I've been reading, really interesting, very early Kagyu meditators. These guys this is kind of from the Mila Repa tradition, literally going in the caves and practicing whatever they were practicing. But then they get a headache, or they would get, some bowel issues, or they would not be able to sleep for several days, and so on and so forth. And they would then sort of probably share with each other. I'm arguing that a lot of this stuff got circulated within contemplative communities, retreatants, and so forth, as a kind of on the medical model of a kind of prescriptive literature. And it was ran and compiled and sort of practiced in parallel to these main practices. Um, so it's really very interesting. I think it actually it says a lot to me about how at that very early period, right? So this is sort of Tibetan Renaissance moment where Buddhism was really still coming from India, and Tibetans were still figuring out what is Buddhism and how does it work for us. And we're very much at that moment now, historically at a different moment, but there's of course these transmission parallels. And what I'm finding, particularly in the Gexel literature, I can make other analogs as well in other contemplative systems, but let's just look at the Gexel material, these obstructions, dispelling obstruction practices. They're experimenting. They're very much testing the waters. What works, what doesn't. First thing. Second thing, they're very interested in replicating what works, right? In other words, when you find something that works, does it work for X, Y, and Z also? And it usually does. So some of this stuff's very, and so they like categorize. Like, for instance, I'm working on anxiety and insecurity. Those are the two that go together that I've been reading lately, right? And emotional insecurity, psychological insecurity. And then there's depression. And they say that these three, you just make slight deviations as to what you do, but they're all kind of very, very similar because the symptoms are very similar. Anyways, this is sort of, so it gets you into sort of thinking of how contemplatives uh, innovated these practices. Yeah.
Is it okay to mention uh, the particular jikung, so jikten sumgon? Is it
Yeah.
so in regards to your last statement, so I read this I think this morning, and I said, okay, directly what you're saying is you mentioned, I don't know if the Tibetan in the text is Ninglung, Ninglung, wind in the heart.
Ninglong. Yeah. The winds in the heart.
Right. So when I was shocked because I practice in the Drikung lineage and have good connections. I've received a lot of this Gexel, and I also, from my side, work to receive and preserve these all these. And one was what you translated. It is replicated in later true core cycles as as a standard one with some changes. So I was kind of shocked. I thought, wow, this is coming out wonderful.
Oh, that's cool.
And
Yeah. I love
and the
this.
second thing, ethnographically, so nowadays a lot of these completion phase practices are getting out there.
Yeah.
I I also have a role in facilitating, and one thing that I think this translation is really valuable for is we can learn about these techniques. We can read translations and good books out there. But when it comes to actually training, practically through instruction, oral instruction, one must at the same time they receive methods, view and method. The body of practice, like receiving instructions on how to work with Gek, or how to enhance bliss, clarity, or non-thought, or
Yeah.
increase heat. They're really refinements of instruction which can't come from books, but translations like this really reflect the richness of these practice traditions. I mean, people just think of Tumo, they think of Trokor, but if we have translators working uh, and really fine detailed translating these concepts, it goes a long way for contemporary practice. Like,
Oh, totally. I mean, I value the, I mean, of course, I value the books tremendously. I think that the Tibetans did a historic, just monumental job in recording, describing contemplative processes and practices and the experiences that emerge from them. And that to have at our disposal this extraordinary record of about 1,000+ years now, about a millennia, is I mean, there's really nothing like it in the world, and it's quite exceptional. Now, of course, the books on their own terms aren't going to transform us, right? That we need to understand what they're saying and we need to apply it and practice it. And that's what, teachers in practice can help facilitate. In fact, are imperative to facilitate. I think that there's this kind of false divide between sort of like, oh, we don't need the books. Um, I think there's some privileged conditions where people can do that, but I don't think we're at that moment now. I think we need the books. And I also think we don't just need the books, we need experience, right? And we need to reframe subjectivity and foreground subjectivity and experience back into our lives because so much has been objectified and pushed. We experience the way that we're taught from young children in this society to experience doesn't recognize our perceptions, our cognitions, our sensations. And if we're going to do transformative work of contemplation, then we need to reframe experience. I think that these materials, certainly the contemplative literature, the meditation manuals and yogic manuals, the stuff that I read, that's what they're for. That's and to remember, we're not alone. People have been doing this for a long time. There are technologies of being human that we don't need to reinvent. We can innovate, we can improve and enhance, and yet there's a deep contemplative human heritage we can draw from. And we have access to that.
Michael, we're coming close to the end of this session, but there was a whole world of discussion around what Tibetan meditation is, what Vajrayana meditation is. Somehow we haven't got there, so I hope we can invite you back. But I think we've inched there through these discussions, how you work interdisciplinarily. But there's at the Contemplative Science Center or your research, this is a topic. In the last minutes, can you tell us a little bit about a forthcoming title that you're working on and kind of the directions of your work now? And also how we can get how listeners can follow or get in touch with you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so two things I think I've mentioned just for one, just my own personal research, but then maybe something more collaborative. I would love to, I think you and I have talked about in the past, and I'd love to mention to your viewers. So the first, my own research now is twofold. One at the university, which is really thinking about contemplation as a human practice, very much not within a Buddhist context per se, but in a very kind of broad, what does it mean for what do contemplation practices look like in different contexts according to different individuals? And what is the research look like to understand the operations, the processes, the underlying mechanics or mechanisms of contemplation and contemplative practices in a broad scope. And that sort of leads to the second, my personal project, which is much more focused on the Tibetan traditions, which is my area, and bringing them into conversation with this kind of broader discourse in cultural psychology and the cognitive sciences and the health sciences and philosophy, and saying a few things. One, I think that these are very diverse practices. These are very diverse practices, and I've been sort of trying to map out, build a typology or a map of the different kinds of contemplative practices and emergent experiences, what I call contemplative styles. So in this book project, I'll be looking at three basic contemplative styles. I mentioned sort of remedial or antidotal styles, non-dual styles. Those sort of things have come up in what I've discussed. And I'm going to be looking at a variety of different styles, but through practices of cultivating attention and what we'll call, attentional focus practices. The second are the category of imaginal practices, and that includes dream yoga and active imagination while sleeping and dreaming, but it also includes visualization and imaginative simulation techniques. And then the third, I'm very interested in practices of embodiment and somatic awareness, and that as a category. So attention, imagination, and embodiment is how my current uh, book project is organized. But then looking at each of those, several Tibetan practices for each, right? So looking at all kinds of different attentional practices, looking at all kinds of different imagination practices, looking at all kinds of embodied practices. Then the bigger project that I hope gains some steam, it's an idea that's been brewing now for some time, and it would really extend practices of embodiment, which I know you, James, are deeply committed to, and the Tibetan yoga practices. And I would love to have a conference, an international, global, if we might, conference on Tibetan yoga. Yoga has now become a buzz term in households in America, and there's a certain concept of what it is. And yet the Tibetan traditions have a lot to contribute to this broader discourse, both in yoga studies, the science of yoga, but also um, practice, right? It's all about practice. So I'd love to have a conference similar to what I did with this generative contemplation initiative at last year, but focused on Tibetan yoga. And if people are interested in collaborating on that, I have several um, academic scholar collaborators, practitioner collaborators. We're looking for funding. We're looking for people to bring energy, and I open that up to you and your community for ideas. Perhaps be in touch with you, and we can be in touch with me. And then the last point is how to be in touch with me is my website, michaelrsheehy.com. And I try to keep it updated or keep stuff up there that's relevant. Thanks so much, James.
Yes, and regarding that list, I have actually been speaking to a number of teachers, retreat masters, practitioners that specifically we are already meeting, and I'd love to stay in contact and hopefully dialogue about that or learn more. But
Yeah.
I want to thank you. This has been really exciting, and hopefully we can have you back to finish that part of the conversation. So, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you, James. I appreciate it. Be well.